Greetings and welcome to From the Basement. In this video, we're going to start taking a look at the terrain system in Unity. Now, as a quick reminder, we've got a couple of asset packages that are preloaded here, so make sure you have these before continuing on with the video. We have the Sample Assets Beta package that's going to provide our character controller. We have the skyboxes from the Standard Assets package to give ourselves some nice skyboxes so that we don't have to have the dull gray background. And we have the Terrain Assets package from the Asset Store, again, Unity provided, not the default one that you get from Assets and Import Package. So we do not want this one. There's not enough stuff in there. So if you have those packages, great. If not, go ahead and pause the video and make sure you have those packages imported into your project before continuing. Now the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to save the scene because we're going to have to continue this over a couple of videos, and so I want to make sure that I have this scene saved out so I can come back to it later. So I'm just going to go to File, New Scene, just to make sure I'm in a brand new clean scene. Then I'm going to go to File, Save Scene, and I'm just going to call this Terrain Demo 1. Now that way when we come back to work on this later, we'll just be able to open this scene up and have our terrain ready to go. So first things first, we've got to actually create the terrain, which is horribly simple. We just go to Game Object, Create Other, Terrain, and we're done. We've got a massive terrain. Now depending on your camera angle, you might not see this exact picture, but you can maneuver around using the controls and such to get a better view of this. Now, it's important to note that this thing is massive. It will take you minutes, literally, to try to walk across this thing on the diagonal. This is effectively a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer area. Now, despite the fact that game characters usually move much faster than a standard walking space, it would take you a very long time to walk across this. And more importantly, it would take you a very long time to actually fill this in with detail. So rather than having this big, massive, wasted space, let's dive into some of the settings that we can use to control the size of our terrain. With the terrain selected, you should see in your inspector a terrain script component. One of these options being a little gearbox, which is sort of the traditional symbol for options. If we click on that gearbox, we can now see all of the options available to us for the terrain. We're going to ignore all of these except for the resolution part, and we're only going to play with a few of these. The numbers that we are going to play with for now are terrain width, length, and height. These are all in meters. Remember, it's a Unity standard. All these numbers represent meters. So we've got a 2,000 meter by 2,000 meter square with a possible range of 600 meters in height. Now, 600 range in height is huge, and I'll show you how big that looks in a moment. But for now, let's correct this terrain width and height. Let's change this to 400. Notice it immediately updates it here in the browser by 400. Now I've got this tiny little square which is partially disappearing due to my view distance, so I'm going to double click on the terrain to zoom in on this guy. So it's still a pretty big chunk of area, but it's a lot more tolerable to deal with this than it is to deal with a 2,000 by 2,000 area. Okay, so now that we've got this down in size, let's go ahead and see what we can do about manipulating and abusing this poor terrain. If we go to this first tool here, the mountain symbol with an arrow going up, this is what we use to actually modify the terrain. With this symbol active, if I put my mouse cursor over the terrain, you should see a little fuzzy blue dot following your cursor around. This shows where I'm going to be manipulating the terrain. You can change your brush type down here. So if I change it to the star, you'll notice my preview changes to that star shape. And if I draw with it now, I get this little star-shaped thing. Or circles. So on and so forth. So the variety of the brushes, some of these are more useful than others. I've honestly never really found much of a use for the star brush, but I suppose you could find some use for it for like really super jagged mountains or something. Now, you can further control this brush by the brush size and the opacity. Size does what you think it does. It makes the brush either bigger or smaller. Opacity is a little bit more confusing. This is basically how fast does it apply the changes to the scene. So I'm going to change back to this brush here, maybe make it a little bit larger. So an opacity, right now my opacity is 25. And if I left click and drag, I can paint down my terrain. And as long as the mouse is moving, notice it's not doing anything right now. As long as the mouse is moving, it adds that value. It paints down additional value to that spot. Opacity determines how fast that changes. So if I turn my opacity down to 0, you can see I've got almost no change going on here. It's very small. Whereas if I crank it up to 100, you can see how much faster this is now. Generally speaking, you want to use the opacity and size settings depending on what you're doing. If you are doing massive sort of primary sculpting of the terrain, you might set it, well, not to 100, that's usually like way too high. You might set it to a fairly high value, especially if you're like trying to sculpt tall mountains or mountain ridges or something like that. And then once you go in to do the detail work, usually you'll switch down to a smaller brush size, a smaller opacity value, and start trying to fill things in. Or maybe you just want to give a little bit of general roughness. You might have your brush size set way up and your opacity set way down, so that way you can just brush down a little bit of roughness to the terrain so it's not perfectly smooth. Now, to lower terrain, it says it right here. Click to raise, hold down shift to lower. So switch to this, increase my opacity here a little bit. Let's decrease my size. Hold shift and left click and nothing happens. Well, that's because by default, your terrain is already as low as it can possibly go. However, if I left shift and left click on areas that I've already painted down, notice I'm going down now. But I will never go past this. You can't go into the negatives. It's 0 or higher as far as your values go for height. So I can go from 0 to 600, can't go down into the negatives. And of course this works with all of the tools, so if I hold down shift and left click, I dig down with that one, so on and so forth. And that pretty much covers that tool. The next tool over is the Paint Height tool. Now this one is useful for a variety of operations. It's useful for like if you want to do ledges. So like maybe I want to create a ledge right here. I have to do two things. First I have to grab my height. Notice here on the instructions it says hold shift to sample target height. So if I press shift and click, notice this height value is changing depending on where I click. So I can shift click here, and now I can get a plateau. It will never paint above that value. I can also lower to that value. Notice how it just automatically starts lowering stuff that is above that value. That's pretty much the Paint the Height tool. Now, where this thing becomes really useful is painting in ledges. So let's say I want a ramp going from here down to here. Well, it would be a little bit difficult to do with the raise tool. You notice I'm getting like some pretty bad spikes, and yeah, that's kind of a pain. So instead what I can do is go to the Paint to Height tool. I'm going to really crank down my opacity here. Like turn it down to 5. And I'm going to shift click where I want to start painting, shift click paint, shift click paint. And it does take a little bit of time to get this to work well. But ever so, oops, clicked on the wrong spot there. Ever so slowly we can see we're getting a small ledge forming up here. So now I've got this little ledge slash pathway thing coming down from this edge. So it's just one of many uses for that tool. The next tool over is our smooth tool. Generally, I tend to use the solid circles for this one. And what the smooth tool does is, well, it smooths out. It averages the values. So I can, apply this over here and try and smooth out the differences of this little ridge thing that I did. It's very noticeable, excuse me, very noticeable if I apply it over a large area on really jagged stuff. Oops, and be forewarned that you can toggle between these different modes by hitting key combinations. And so it's very easy to end up on this guy here, the Paint Height tool, because it's bound to W. And so if you do it wrong, you can very easily end up on that and start changing things. So pay attention to that. So if I take my smooth tool here, you notice I am smoothing out those jagged peaks so they're not quite so jagged. Or if I come over here to this solid vertical cliff wall, oops, see, just did it again, Control Z. Smooth out that cliff wall so it's not quite so cliffy. And again, opacity will determine a lot on how much you do this. A very low opacity, and you'll slowly melt things down. A very high opacity, and you'll quickly smooth things out into absolute mush. Keep in mind of what you're trying to go for. Some terrain looks good hyper smoothed. Some terrain types do not look good hyper smoothed. They look better with a little bit of ruggedness to them. The next tool over is the texture tool. Now at the moment we've been working in just this plain gray texture. And of course we don't want to leave that in there. The texture tool is what you use to paint down textures. Now the first time you add in a texture, that is going to be applied to the entire terrain. So make sure this is the texture that you are going to have the most of. So maybe grass is the primary texture I want for this scene. So I would go to Edit Textures, Add Texture, because there's nothing really to edit right now. Select, and I've got all kinds of stuff in here. So I'm just going to type in grass in my search bar here and filter it down. Do not choose grasses that kind of look like billboards like this. This is for the billboard grass, adding it in as a visual effect. This is not for general purpose, applying to the terrain. You do not want this one. So I'm going to take grass meadow here. And by default, the terrain package, the terrain asset package that they provided was created before they switched to having a normal map. So there is no more normal map for this, which is fine. You don't have to add a normal map in. So I'm going to click on Add, leave all my settings the same, and boom! There we go. Grass everywhere. Now, maybe I want some rock textures on these mountains, so I'm going to go to Edit, Add, Select, and, well, I just happen to know that cliff is a pretty good one. So I'm going to choose this cliff layer here. Click on Add. Now, nothing happened right away. What I have to do now is click on the cliff texture here, and then click to apply it down. Now, one thing you'll notice, I'm sure, is that it applies things down fast. Well, again, we've got our opacity settings. My opacity right now is set to 100. So it's instant, full-on material. And if I want to remove it, I basically have to switch back to grass and paint the grass back down over it. Now, if I crank this opacity down, like, say, to 10, it's still going to look like it's near instance. If I just click once, you can see that it applied it overlay. So once, twice, 3 times, and already it's looking pretty rocky. You have to remember, it's going to apply this every single time you get an action from the mouse, which means as you move the mouse, it doesn't take a lot of movement for it to get full on. Usually when you're trying to apply texture opacities, you want to have a very low opacity setting so that you can actually try to apply it better. And most of the time what I do actually is click rather than try and move the mouse, unless I know that, okay, this part here is a rocky area, so I can just move it. But if I'm trying to get a slightly less than full-on effect, I will usually rely on clicking maybe a very tiny bit of controlled mouse movements to try and get the effect that I'm looking for, because it's just too hard otherwise. And we can layer down quite a few different textures. So I can add in another one here, select, let's see here, good dirt. We don't want poor dirt, we want good dirt. And come in here, maybe reduce my brush size, change to this little messy one here. Oops, make sure I change to my dirt. And try and put down a little bit of dirt. Down along these edges here, so on and so forth. Now I could change my opacity settings, or my target strength too. So let's say I know I want to make this, let's say this part over here, dirty, but I don't want it full on strength. I can change this. So I can say, okay, you know what, I only want to go up to 33% strength. So no matter what I do, I'm not going to go above 33% strength on this area here. Now maybe I want to bump it up a little bit more, give myself some stronger edges here, and maybe a little bit more to get some patches. Now unfortunately, while as much as I would love it, there is no smooth tool for the default controls as far as textures go. I would love it if there was, but sadly there's not. This is where the patterned tools really come into play, because I can use this to click around here on the edges and get a nice feathering look in. And if I really want to feather it out, I can, decrease it down so that way I'm not going to go too far up. And I can then take my rock texture here, maybe switch back to a brush. Now one thing you'll notice, and you should notice at least, is that on vertical faces like this, the textures get really stretched. That's just something you have to watch out for, because that is a limitation of how the terrain works. And one last thing before we wrap up this video. We'll save trees and vegetation for a later video because those are a little bit of a pain. And that is resetting your terrain. So I've got all sorts of garbage and stuff around here. It is possible to fully reset the height map. It is not really all that possible to reset your textures. Short of like trying to remove them, you can remove all of your textures, and that will reset all the information. But you might not necessarily want to do that if you know you want to use those materials. As far as resetting the height map, you've got a couple of options. You could go to Paint to Height and just simply, okay, yeah, I want to have a max brush size, a max opacity, and I want 0 for my height. And then go through and just melt everything down. Works fine for this small terrain, but not so much for others. There's one other tool that we can use, though, and that is flatten. It's this flatten button right here. And what this does is if I put in a value, let's say I put in 50, and I hit flatten, what that does is it flattens the entire terrain to that value. This also means I can now paint down and get a hole like that. All right, and actually one last thing. We have a hole down here at 0. Let's change this to 600. That is a 600-meter difference. So if we're all the way down here where the player is, that is what a 600-meter difference would look like. So as you can see, even just a 50-meter difference, that's a pretty darn high wall right there. 600 meters is massive. And just simply trying to provide a player with a way to get from 0 to 600 would be a difficult undertaking. So keep that in mind. Alright, that finishes up this video. The next one, we will take a look at trees and flowers.